Okay, let's get started. My name is Tapio Salonen. I'm one of the pro-vice chancellors here at the Malmö University, and I greet you all so warmly welcome to this seminar. As you know, Malmö is a young, urban, striving university, and as you know, we have been this year fully fledged university, and we will take decisive steps for the future in both education and research. And to mark this change, we take different kinds of steps. One is this seminar series that we launched now for 1 year back. We call it Knowledge for Change. And we thereby invite well-reckoned scholars to take up different kinds of topics that we find crucial for our university. And today we will focus on the role of the university in the age of Trumpism, with worldwide trends of growing inequalities and social tensions. And my role is now to invite one of our dear guest professors, Mustafa Dices, to make the introduction. Please give Mustafa a warm hand. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome. I have the honor and pleasure to introduce Professor Ananya Roy. Before I start, however, let me tell you a bit about the format. Professor Roy will talk about 50 minutes or so. After that, we will open the floor for questions and discussion, and we have this room until 5 p.m., so I think this will give us enough time to engage with the themes coming out from her talk. Now to the introduction. I thought I shouldn't just tell you about Professor Roy just by summarizing the contents of her personal webpage, because I thought you could read them yourself. Her webpage will tell you that she is professor of urban planning, social welfare, and geography at the University of California, Los Angeles, or UCLA. The webpage will also tell you that before moving to UCLA, she was distinguished professor at the University of California, Berkeley. The webpage wouldn't tell you, however, how mesmerized her students would be during her lectures, or how many of them started to see the world around them in a new way that made them much more sensitive to issues of poverty, racism, and inequality, especially in urban contexts. These are Professor Roy's areas of interest and expertise. And if you are also interested in these issues, I would recommend her 2 books, among many other publications, Poverty Capital, and a more recent one entitled Encountering Poverty, Thinking and Acting in an Unequal World. Now, the subtitle of this second book hints at what makes Ananya such a special scholar and friend. Her insistence on not just thinking, but acting. Not just writing about the world, but actively engaging with it to make it a better place. At UCLA, she continues in the same fashion as the director of the Institute on Inequality and Democracy. She is, on the one hand, revolutionizing urban studies and urban theory through her scholarly writing, and on the other, fighting for equality, democracy, and justice with her public engagements and by mentoring new generations of activists at UCLA. Professor Roy's talk today is entitled Liberal Democracy and Its Racial Others, the West in the Age of Trumpism. And this is part of the Knowledge for Change series, as my colleague Tapio just mentioned. But I wonder, what are we to do in a world where the president of the most powerful state brags about not having read a book in his life? Where an openly racist and misogynist man could get elected president of the land of the free and home of the brave? Well, Professor Roy will clearly show us that it is not really land of the free and home of the brave. She will show us how liberal democracies of the West, not just the United States, constituted themselves through the production of racialized others, and how such orders are now on the brink of imploding. The abstract of her talk brings to mind James Baldwin's words written more than 50 years ago. So please bear with me while I read this paragraph from him. Everything now, we must assume, is in our hands. We have no right to assume otherwise. If we, and now I mean the relatively conscious whites and the relatively conscious blacks, who must, like lovers, insist on or create the consciousness of the others, if we do not falter in our duty now, we may be able, handful that we are, to end the racial nightmare and achieve our country and change the history of the world. If we do not now dare everything, if we do not now risk everything, the fulfillment of that prophecy recreated from the Bible in a song by a slave is upon us. God gave Noah the rainbow sign, no more water, the fire next time. But we should perhaps stop worrying about the sad state of the United States and start to think about ourselves a bit. Should we get worried here in Sweden? Aren't we on safe ground, given that this is a country generally cited as a model of equality and peace? Yes and no. No, we are not on safe ground, and yes, we should get worried, very worried indeed. We should get worried because Sweden has the fastest growing inequality rate among rich countries, because it leads in the list of largest unemployment gap between natives and foreign-born, because it has miserable weather, because it has a severe housing shortage, because it is becoming a textbook example of racialized segregation in urban contexts, all of which are feelings of anxiety and resentment with growing social tensions. And a month ago, we have received a clear sign of the direction that Sweden is heading towards. The anti-immigrant and nationalist Sweden Democrats Party, with its roots in the neo-Nazi movement, now has a seat at the table. So no, we are not safe. No one is safe. Winter is here. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Ananya Roy.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here at Malmö University for the Knowledge for Change series. I would like to thank Pro Vice Chancellor Tapio Salonen and, of course, my friend and colleague and comrade, Professor Mustafa Dikic, for that beautiful introduction and for the invitation, and Carolina Rosenquist for organizing my visit. The key propositions underlying my talk this afternoon are these. The Trump presidency has brought to sharp light the enduring racial inequalities through which liberal democracy is constituted and lived. Of course, Trumpism is not unique to the United States. The ideology of right-wing nationalism, complete with xenophobia and Islamophobia, is evident in many parts of the world, including many parts of Europe. But the age of Trumpism also returns us to the long-standing question of freedom, which lies at the heart of liberal democracy, and one that we must consider with urgent necessity. In particular, it raises the question of the role of knowledge, of the university, at times such as these. So let me start with a brief analysis of Trumpism. Trumpism is not wholly new. Its racialized logic is only the most recent iteration of the long history of racial terror, a phrase that I borrow from Paul Gilroy's path-breaking book, The Black Atlantic. Trumpism's practices of expulsion inhabit a post-9/11 machinery of deportation and surveillance perfected by many American presidents, including President Obama. The capitalist interests represented by Trump's cabinet, the explicit calculus of life and death at stake in its policy agendas, are continuous with America's ongoing war on the poor, often waged through such things as environmental racism or the war on drugs. Yet in my writings, since the fateful election of Trump, I have repeatedly argued that we must treat Trumpism as something new, as a rupture in the political and social fabric of the world. The mark of that rupture for me is the institutionalization of white nationalism in state power and statecraft. Thus, in his essay, The First White President, published recently in The Atlantic, Ta-Nehisi Coates has argued that Trump's ideology is white supremacy in all its truculent and sanctimonious power. This analysis is important because in the wake of Trump's election, we have been inundated, and I find similar narratives here in Europe, narratives of economic hardship, tales of an American working class looking for a salve for the loss of livelihood and status in the face of neoliberal globalization. But I want to be clear. It is the white working class that fueled Trump's election. Black women and Latinas, two groups that have been hit the hardest by neoliberal globalization, did not in any way vote for Trump. So it is not the worker who determined Trump's election. Rather, it is the white voter. And to understand this, we have to turn to the path-breaking work of W.E.B. Du Bois, the first prominent African-American sociologist, specifically a book called Black Reconstruction in America, published in 1935, in which Du Bois gives us this wonderful phrase, the wages of whiteness. Du Bois, writing about the United States prior to emancipation, notes that only a small proportion of Southern society owned slaves. The puzzle that he's interested in is how what he describes as a mass of poor whites who were economic outcasts were invested fully in slavery, including in the means of violence necessary to maintain slavery. And he explains this as the wages, public and psychological, of whiteness. We are once again in post-racial America witnessing the wages of whiteness. What this means then is that it is insufficient for us to conceptualize the political economy of the United States in our standard social science vocabulary of neoliberalism or globalization. Instead, we have to consider that all capitalisms are necessarily racial capitalisms, and that in North America, the form and function of capitalism is embedded in the specific histories of settler colonialism, chattel slavery, and imperialism. What is key to Trumpism, then, is how racialized logics of exclusion, colonial logics, are reactivated and repurposed to wage war against those perceived as racial outsiders. It's a mistake to think of this only as immigration policy. It is, in fact, about utter dehumanization, So here is one of Trump's many quotes about asylum seekers at the US-Mexico border. The insistence on talking about immigrants as animals, the insistence on talking about them as violent gang members, as those who are worthy of dehumanization. So I'd like us to think about this as white racial domination, and to do so, we need to think about a pivotal figure in the Trump inner circle, even though he's seemingly no longer part of that circle. And that is a guy called Stephen Bannon, white nationalist and media mogul. Some of you are shaking your heads in recognition. The notorious executive order, now known as the Muslim ban, was in fact Bannon's idea. He started writing that policy well before Trump came to power. So it's important for us to take a closer look at the specific contours of race thinking among figures such as Bannon. There's been a lot of writing recently in the United States about how Bannon's race thinking has been deeply influenced by a novel titled The Camp of the Saints, authored in 1973 by an obscure French writer, Jean Raspail. This novel has recently been shown to be a prominent feature in several circles of organized white supremacy in the United States. The novel tells the story of the invasion of France by an armada of Indians who are described as thousands of wretched creatures with fleshless Gandhi-like arms, led by a turd eater. The influx is enabled by liberal politicians and religious leaders in Europe, including, coincidentally, a pope from Latin America. And it sets into motion what the novel describes as the end of the white world. The novel's white heroes, who are the only fully human depictions in the story, take up arms to defend the last vestiges of European Christendom. Bannon has repeatedly cast immigration, particularly immigration into Europe, as the end of the white world. To quote him, he calls it an invasion into Central and then Western and Northern Europe. He calls it a global camp of the saints. What is at stake in such white nationalism is the imagination of the border. The border is everywhere. It is made and remade in neighborhoods, in homes, in poet Erica Sanchez's words, in flesh threaded with desert. The border, as we are learning in both the United States and in Europe, is deliberately a place of death, of civil death, social death, and physical death. These images are from a collection titled The American Dream by Thomas Kiefer, who worked as a janitor at the Customs and Border Processing Center in Ajo, Arizona. His art curates the confiscated personal belongings of migrants who have been detained or deported or who died crossing the border. Liberal democracy entails the practice of what Michel Foucault has called biopolitics, the management of human life. We're all familiar with this. From healthcare to social welfare, from schools to social housing, the institutions of biopolitics generate their own forms of differentiated inclusion. But what the philosophers of modernity often miss, and what scholars of colonialism point us to, is the relationship between biopolitics and necropolitics. Necropolitics, as Achille Mbembe argues, is the ultimate expression of sovereignty, and it resides in the power and capacity to decide who may live and who must die. Civil death, social death, physical death. The outrage over children ripped from their parents at Trump's border is vitally important. This image went viral. But the practice of family separation is not new in the United States. From the tearing apart of enslaved families to the forcible placement of Native American children in so-called Indian schools, social death has long been a feature of American life. And is it different on this side of the Atlantic? Nicholas de Genova insists that if we are to think about Europe, we have to do so at the threshold of Europe, where Europe's colonial present becomes visible. This threshold, he argues, is made up of a series of externalized border zones, including the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean today, in de Genova's words, is a mass grave. This image, too, went viral. Now, I want to be clear that border-making practices are not unique to the North Atlantic. They're not unique to the West. Take the case of India, where a Hindu nationalist regime precedes and previews Trumpism. Under the BJP government, led by Narendra Modi, state power, as in the case of the United States, has focused on the illegalization of migrants, specifically Bangladeshi migrants. In the northeastern territories of India, such as the state of Assam, the Modi government has deployed various technologies of illegalization, most recently, as of just a couple of months ago, an updated National Register of Citizens, which just in the state of Assam has stripped 4 million people of citizenship, leaving them undocumented and stateless. The language of foreigners, of illegal encroachers, of terrorists, dehumanizes and criminalizes migrants, but it also creates an equivalence between religious difference and border crossing, turning Indian Muslims into Bangladeshi migrants, and by extension, in the language of the Modi government, into potential terrorists. Now, I want to spend the rest of my time this evening outlining what at first glance seems to be a battle between liberal democracy on the one hand and right-wing nationalism on the other hand. But, as I'm sure you've already figured out, I'm going to argue that these are not necessarily opposing ideologies, that liberal democracy is constituted through practices of racial othering, and that imaginations and practices of liberal integration are insufficient to address the exclusions of racial capitalism. In particular, I will focus on the ways in which liberal democracy seeks to construct a space of freedom and cosmopolitanism in the wake of right-wing nationalism. And given that I'm an urbanist, I'm particularly interested in how liberal democracy conjures up a space of freedom, of exception, that is the city. The city is seen to be the site of civitas, of demos, of worldliness. It is the place of sanctuary, of refuge, of hospitality. Perhaps this is best captured in Derrida's writings. In his essay on cosmopolitanism, Derrida writes, if we look to the city rather than to the state, it is because we have given up hope that the state might create a new image for the city. As an urbanist, this is of particular interest to me, and I want to explore then the possibilities and limits of liberal democracy and liberal integration by thinking about the city. So let's return one more time to Trump. One of the first acts, in fact, the very first executive order issued by the Trump administration, only a few days after he was sworn in as the 45th president of the US, was an order titled Enhancing Public Safety in the Interior of the United States. That executive order argued that illegal aliens were a significant threat to national security and public safety, and it directed all jurisdictions to comply with federal immigration laws and noted that those failing to do so would be cut off from federal funds, everything from funds for education to funds for policing. In particular, the order called out what are known as sanctuary cities and their refusal to assist the federal government with or implement deportation orders. As a direct rejoinder, the mayor of Boston declared that he would use City Hall itself as a last shelter to provide safety for undocumented immigrants. A few days later, the city of San Francisco, which for a long time has been a sanctuary city, sued the Trump administration, charging that its threats violated the states' right provision of the US Constitution. Since then, legal challenges have continued, with mayors of the largest, most progressive cities in the United States in pitched legal battle against the Trump administration, refusing to have cities turned into national borders. Trump, in turn, has recently sharpened the language of race thinking, characterizing sanctuary cities as crime-infested and breeding, and considering them in opposition to the demands of the people of the state for security and safety. Now, what precisely is a sanctuary city? As I will explain in just a few minutes, it's an ancient concept, but in its modern guise in the United States, the idea of sanctuary is quite specific. It is a prohibition on the cooperation of local law enforcement, local police forces, with federal immigration enforcement, what is known as ICE, or Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Specifically with this, I know you can't really read this, this is what is called an ICE detainer. It's an order issued by ICE to local police forces to detain someone whose immigration status might be suspect. Sanctuary cities are therefore an assertion of local sovereignty, and that assertion of sovereignty then rests on local police power. In that sense, sanctuary is a paradigm of liberal inclusion, a paradigm of liberal inclusion that turns on the concept of local police power. The implications are significant. Without going into the details, let me note that sanctuary cities, while hailed as a beacon of hope in the struggles of Trumpism, cannot be easily reconciled with the major social movements of our day, notably with Black Lives Matter. Those movements, particularly Black Lives Matter, have drawn attention to the murderous character of local police forces in the United States. So we're faced then with one of the key paradoxes of liberal inclusion. The most prominent advocates of sanctuary, such as Rahm Emanuel, who is currently mayor of Chicago, he was Obama's chief of staff. He is also one of the fiercest proponents of the expansion of police power. And his pet project is the building of a $95 million police academy in the heart of Chicago. Such police power in the United States must be understood in the long history of racial terror. That terror did not end with slavery, but rather took on new forms, notably lynching. In fact, as Gilroy notes, coercive regimes continued well after the end of slavery under the banner of freedom and took the form of industrialized killing legitimized through race thinking. What I want to emphasize then is that sanctuary or not, for quite a while now, cities in the West have been places of violence, and in fact, they have been places that have been turned into borders. Following Nicholas de Genova, I understand the border to be a spectacle of exclusion that also hides an obscene secret: the inclusion of illegalized migration. Border enforcement, then, is not simply confined to the physical space of the border, the actual border line. Instead, the border is an extended zone of enforcement that eventually encompasses the entirety of the space of the nation and plays itself out in all sorts of so-called interior spaces in association with the everyday life of migrants. DeGenova writes that migrants, I quote, are made to carry the border on their backs, to wear the border on their faces, ever increasingly subjected to various degrees of border enforcement wherever they may go. What does it mean then when we think about the city in the long history of racial terror? What does it mean for liberal integration and inclusion when we think about the city not as a space of civitas, but as border? One example, one hopeful example, comes from the roots of the sanctuary movement in the United States, which was about challenging American imperialism. In the 1980s, churches and synagogues and eventually city governments provided refuge to asylum seekers fleeing war in Central America, notably Guatemala and El Salvador. The majority of these refugees were denied asylum by the American government, and they faced deportation. The sanctuary movement provided refuge, even at the risk of prosecution by the federal government. In particular, the movement had a keen sense of how refugees fleeing these wars were in fact fleeing violence instigated by American imperialism in Central America. So the movement was about transnational responsibility and obligation. The first of these citywide ordinances came in San Francisco in 1985, and that ordinance, which provided asylum rights for those fleeing violence in El Salvador and Guatemala, Section 1 of that ordinance stated the following: the people of the United States owe a particular responsibility to political refugees from El Salvador and Guatemala because of the role that the US military and other war-related aid has played in prolonging the political conflicts in these countries. These initial ordinances from San Francisco to Ithaca, New York, were later broadened to provide protection for other refugees and undocumented immigrants. I view the sanctuary movement of the 1980s as an important lesson. It is a departure from the format of liberal inclusion. It was a civil initiative, one of many fronts in mobilization against American imperialism. And unlike today's sanctuary practices, which seek to consolidate local police power, the movement of the 1980s was a direct challenge to what they called the legal and moral authority of the United States government. I also view the movement as a distinctive articulation of revolutionary humanism, a politics of recognition that is embedded in anti-colonial struggles around the world. Let me, with this story of the 1980s in mind, now turn to Europe, to consider similar imaginations and practices here, notably what in the European context has been called cities of refuge. In an essay titled The European Question, Migration, Race and Post-Colonial'ti in Europe, Nicholas DeGenova observes that Europeanness is once again an elusive master signifier. In particular, he argues there is a preoccupation with the migration question, with migrants crashing the gates of Europe, and he notes that the European question then is bound up with the migration question. The European question, he emphasizes, is a racial problem. He describes it as a problem of post-colonial whiteness. One of the most ambitious visions for a European city of refuge comes from Derrida. In 1997, in a speech to the International Parliament of Writers held in Strasbourg, Derrida makes the case for hospitality. Already in place in Europe was a network of cities of asylum and a resolution by the Council of Europe to support this network of cities, mainly to protect writers. Writers such as Salman Rushdie, who faced threats and persecution in different parts of the world. The European Charter of 1995 had declared, I quote, a twofold protection of the writer. On the one hand, the right to freedom of expression, and on the other hand, the right to asylum. The Charter also declared the city as a community with an unshakable faith in the democratic values of freedom and law. Derrida, in his 1997 speech, dramatically broadens the charge of refuge. He notes that the focus on the writer is insufficient and unnecessary. He argues that cities must protect, I quote, the foreigner in general, the immigrant, the exiled, the deported, the stateless, the displaced. Ethics is hospitality, he insists. Building on the writings of Levinas and seeking to transcend the limits of Kantian cosmopolitanism, Derrida famously calls for an absolute hospitality. In his words, extended not only to the foreigner provided with a family name, with the social status of being a foreigner, but to the absolute, unknown, anonymous other. The city is an important figuration in Derrida's exposition of hospitality. For him, the city of refuge is what he calls a free city. It is one that transforms and reforms the modalities of membership by which the city belongs to the state. Derrida writes that the city is above nation states, and the freedom of the city does not rest on police power. Indeed, Derrida calls for a restriction of the legal powers and scope of the police, and instead places questions of rights, refuge, and asylum in the political authority of the city and the relationship of the city to what he calls the renewal of international law. Derrida's exposition of hospitality has been understood to be a radical ethics of cosmopolitanism. For him, hospitality is not a gift. It is not tolerance. It is a response to an unanticipated arrival. It is the response to a visitation for which no invitation had been issued. It is also, interestingly, an undermining of the tenet of property and of proprietorship. Derrida argues that hospitality precedes property. What he means by that is that the seeming host, welcoming, providing hospitality, is not a host. That host is herself or himself a refugee, someone in exile, someone who is already guest, not proprietor. So observers such as David Carroll, writing about Derrida's notion of hospitality, says that Derrida's notion of hospitality, what makes it radical, is that it is based not on possession. I possess this home. I possess this community, this city, this nation, and I therefore welcome you, stranger to this land. But rather it is premised on radical dispossession. And with that in mind, I see Derrida's refusal of the proprietary prerogatives of property as a radical expansion of the concept of sanctuary. It bears resonance, in fact, to the sanctuary activism of the 1980s. Derrida's philosophy is also grounded in a very specific European relationship to colonialism. David Carroll, in particular, has argued that Derrida's notions of dispossession, of a personhood that is always dispossessed, must always be understood in relation to exile and refuge, derives from what Carroll beautifully calls the remains of Algiers. He attributes it to Derrida's Judeo-Franco-Maghrebian genealogy. Derrida, in Monolingualism of the Other, writes, I lost and then gained back French citizenship. I lost it for years without having another. And then one day, one fine day, without once again my asking for anything, and still too young to know it in a properly political knowledge, I found the citizenship again. The state to which I never spoke had given it back to me. Here then, as Carol notes, we have the experience of, and this is Carol's language, the outsider who is declared by law not to be in his proper place, even in the place where he has always been. The outsider who's declared by law not to be in his proper place, even in the place where he has always been. Algeria indeed haunts Derrida's concept of hospitality. It disrupts his notions of personhood. It marks what Derrida himself calls the disorder of identity. It renders impossible any notion of inclusion that is not already entangled with expulsion, any notion of modernity that is not already constituted through colonial violence. I interpret Derrida's philosophy of refuge as locating the city not at the heart of the nation, but rather at its threshold, at its colonial threshold, that unending border. And in this way, then, the city and the nation itself has to be understood not as secured territory, but as stolen land. Here, for example, is Palestinian-Canadian rapper Belly on Twitter responding to one of our loudest white supremacists, someone called Tommy Laren, who says, "We owe illegal immigrants nothing." And he responds with a line that you must have heard many times by many public intellectuals and activists: "No one can be illegal on stolen land." So let me be clear. Derrida's concept of unconditional hospitality requires critical interrogation. Colonialism in Derrida's writings appears as a haunting, a disorder of identity for the Franco-Maghrebian Jew. The racial terror of colonialism, especially the brutal longevity of the French occupation of Algeria, slips out of view in his writings. And perhaps this is why Derrida is able to talk about radical dispossession as a universal condition, one that destabilizes host-guest relations everywhere. He suggests that such refusal to possession has equal meaning for colonized and colonizer. It erases the embodied specificity of necropolitics. It erases that for some, living at that colonial threshold, identity is post-colonial whiteness, whereas for others, it is a mass grave. And yet, what his destabilizing of property does is precisely draw attention to the fact that we might all be on stolen land, in fact, that we are all on stolen land, and that sheer fact then renders suspect any notions of illegalization. So in the final section of the talk, building on this idea that no one can be illegal on stolen land, and focusing on the theme of this seminar series, Knowledge for Change, I want to turn to the university and the possible role of the university and of academic knowledge, not only in times of Trumpism, but in relation to liberal democracy. In particular, I want to demonstrate what our research and pedagogy might look like when we start not with liberal integration and inclusion, but rather we start with notions of stolen land. We start with the colonial threshold. And we start with the idea, this was an essay I'd written days after Trump got elected, we start with the mandate to divest from whiteness. This is the work that we're trying to do at the Institute on Inequality and Democracy at UCLA, an institute for which I have the great privilege of serving as founding director. We are rather new. We've been in existence for about 2 years. And with the election of Trump, we have been quite clear that our mandate is, in fact, to push for a dismantling of white racial domination. In particular, we want to think about the ways in which this is possible, but also requires a commitment to what we call decolonizing the university. For us, this is not just about diversity and inclusion, something that we hear quite a bit about at elite universities. The language of liberal integration at elite US universities is about diversity, equity, and inclusion, which has become a massive bureaucracy. I'd be curious to hear about what the Swedish equivalent might be. But for us, this is about a transformation of the curriculum and canon itself. Once again, we follow Achille Mbembe, who in the context of the radical student movements that have been unfolding in South African universities, notes that decolonizing the university must create, I quote, a right to belong, which is not just about tolerance or assimilation, but rather, in Mbembe's words, about ownership of a space that is a public common good. Mbembe in particular calls for pedagogies of presence. Pedagogies of presence. And for us at UCLA, thinking about pedagogies of presence has meant rooting our work in an analysis of racial capitalism. It has also meant seeking to transform what are known as university-community relationships. We are committed to what I call critical race praxis. This means conceptualizing racialized dispossession, not as something that exists outside the university, but thinking about how the university, as an institution of liberal democracy and of racial capitalism, in fact has been founded in many cases through racialized dispossession. So UCLA, my university, sits on what we call occupied land. The Chancellor just sent out a long email yesterday, once again acknowledging this. We sit quite literally on land that had been stolen from the Tongva people. We are a great land-grant public university built at precisely the moment that the state of California set about the violent annihilation of California's indigenous population. As you must have noticed, elite universities on the East Coast of the United States, from Harvard to Brown to MIT, are sorting through their relationship with slavery. For us at the Institute on Inequality and Democracy, decolonizing the university has also meant crossing another border, an invisible but real border, that between what is seen to be academic knowledge and what is seen to be radical social movements. I worry quite a bit about the great distance between elite universities and social movements, between theory constituted with a capital T and the lived practices of racial capitalism in marginalized communities fighting for their lives. After all, democracy, radical democracy, is renewed and remade through social movements. Do we, as university-based scholars, have a role to play in the great freedom struggles of our times, or have we made ourselves thoroughly irrelevant? Are we on the barricades and front lines, or are we cloistered in our disciplines? And so at the Institute, we have seen the work of social movements as providing a moral compass for the university. I teach urban planning, and one of the first reasons I assign to my graduate students is a platform for the movement for Black lives. It is a brilliant and meticulous planning document, something that my colleague at UCLA, Robin D.G. Kelly, who's one of the most important scholars of Black studies today, Robin Kelly talks about these sorts of platforms as freedom dreams. We can trace that arc from James Baldwin to the movement for Black lives, and in particular he notes that this platform is a blueprint for social change in America. So there my gesture towards radical dispossession, and it is a gesture. But racial justice movements start from the incontrovertible fact of stolen land and enslaved bodies. This type of focus shifts the role of the university in social change from observation to accompaniment. George Lipset, yet another brilliant Black studies scholar, has argued, and I quote, that accompaniment recognizes the inescapable and quintessentially social nature of both scholarship and citizenship. Drawing on the practice of accompaniment as conceived by Archbishop Oscar Romero in El Salvador in the 1970s, this entails equity-oriented collaborative research with social movements based in communities experiencing dispossession and displacement. In Lipsitz's terms, it means repositioning academic disciplines as action to address suffering. So at the Institute on Inequality and Democracy, we do not see liberal democracy as the antidote for socioeconomic inequality. In fact, we study and act upon the ways in which democracies perpetuate inequality. Put another way, we focus on biopolitics, especially in disciplines such as mine, urban planning, social welfare, but we also focus on necropolitics, on geographies of criminalization, illegalization, and death. So I'm going to give you just a couple of examples. One of the projects we're very proud to support is titled $1 Million Hoods, and it's led by Professor Kelly Lytle Hernandez in the Department of History at UCLA. The $1 Million Hoods project exposes the spatialized logics of criminalization and illegalization in Los Angeles. These are the systems of carcerality that Michelle Alexander has very famously called the new Jim Crow. And this, for me, is one of the most urgent policy issues of our time in the United States. Los Angeles is the carceral capital of the United States. The LA Police Department and LA Sheriff's Department spend $1 billion a year incarcerating people. As $1 Million Hood shows, much of that public investment in incarceration, because that's what it is, takes place in a handful of neighborhoods, those marked in red on this map. These, not surprisingly, are communities with long histories of racialized dispossession. And even within these communities, those targeted by these forms of illegalization and incarceration are predominantly African American and Latino men. So this is just one little spot in what is called Antelope Valley, the city of Lancaster. This is data from 2010, so from 2010 to 2017, you can see how much was spent on incarcerating primarily black and brown bodies. And like the border, this logic of carcerality permeates all social institutions. It is in keeping with a long history of racial terror that I already outlined. It is the colonial logic of dispossession in the United States. So one of our programs at the Institute is an activist in residence program, where we make it possible for activists in the city of Los Angeles to be on a sabbatical at the university and to use that time to write the history of their movements, to write the theoretical frameworks that underpin their movements, and most importantly, to develop strategies for what the movement will do next. Our activist in residence this year at the Institute was Manuel Criollo, who has spent years of organizing to remove police from schools in Los Angeles. So I know that here in Sweden, this might seem very weird. The Los Angeles School Police Department is one of the largest police departments, period, in the United States. And it is the starting point of what we call the school-to-prison pipeline for black and brown youth in Los Angeles. One of Criollo's most important recent campaigns was to lobby for the LA School Police Department to return to the Department of Defense military-grade weaponry that the LA School Police Department had acquired, including a tank, 3 grenade launchers, and 61 M16 rifles. So when I talk about these colonial logics, I'm not kidding. So here, once again, is that $1 Million Hoods map. You don't have to know LA County. I just want you to think about this broad geography. This is a map from 1939 produced by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, a government entity that perfected and practiced what we call redlining, which was the utter exclusion of racial, ethnic, minority communities from access to mortgage financing and from home ownership, and therefore from wealth. There is, in fact, a very close correspondence between those histories of redlining and the current reality of carcerality and racial terror in the United States. Here's the crux of this, though. We are interested not just in analyzing these patterns and not just in shifting public investment from carcerality to housing. That is vital work and it's difficult work. We are also interested in acknowledging and acting upon the ways in which our very own disciplines and professions have produced this. So I get enthusiastic urban planning students who want to dismantle landscapes of segregation, right? Who want to burn it all down, who want to smash these systems of incarceration. And yet what we often need to start with is a map like this, because my discipline, urban planning, produced this. It produced the very landscapes of segregation that we now wish to dismantle. We were not just complicit. We were not just bystanders. We actively produced these forms of racial exclusion and separation. So when I call for divesting from whiteness, I'm very interested in such things as redistribution and reparations. And when I use that term reparations, I'm inspired, of course, by the social movements of our time, notably the movement for Black Lives. And I don't mean it as a rhetorical question, but I'm also increasingly convinced that the discussion of reparations has to train a spotlight on the disciplines and professions implicated in the production of inequality. Disciplines and professions that were forged in the crucible of structural racism, colonialism, and imperialism. These ethical frameworks, I'm arguing, have a new urgency in the age of Trumpism. If we want to consider knowledge for change, then we have to refuse obedience to both colorblind liberalism and white nationalism. We can call this many things. In some of my work now in the United States, I'm calling this the politics of refusal. And I'll give you an example. So just a few days after Trump's election, the American Institute of Architects, which is the main professional organization for practicing architects, with about 89,000 members in the United States, the leadership of the AIA issued a public statement pledging support to the newly elected president, arguing that the AIA was ready to work with him to build new infrastructure for the country, and expressing hope and confidence that architects would be able to demonstrate their role, their public role, in serving the public interest of the United States, particularly by producing jobs through the building of infrastructure. As you can imagine, that statement triggered a rebellion in the ranks of the AIA, including a Twitter storm under the hashtag #NotMyAIA. The AIA then issued a retraction statement, which was very mild, which didn't address the point and simply said that the AIA stands for equity, inclusion, and diversity. The most prominent deans of architecture around the country were interviewed and were asked to take a stand. Most refused to take a stand. One did, Jonathan Massey, who's now Dean of the Tubman College of Architecture and Planning at the University of Michigan. And it's really based on Massey's stand that I am articulating this concept of a politics of refusal. Massey insisted that what had happened in the United States was a whitelash. It was white supremacy. And that he, as a professional architect and as a dean of architecture, would not in any way be aligned with it. he went on to state that there is some work an architect must refuse. He asked, would you design Trump's border wall? How about a border station for his Homeland Security Department, a conversion therapy clinic? He concluded, I quote, that withholding our labor is architectural agency in one of its strongest forms. The time indeed is upon us for a politics of refusal. So another example. I'm sure you've all followed the border-making practices of the Trump administration. Children ripped from the arms of parents, mainly Central American families, fleeing violence in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. Children not only separated from their parents, but paperwork deliberately destroyed by Trump officials so that these children cannot be reunited with their parents easily. These children, in turn, have been placed in warehouses masquerading as shelters. But once again, we are involved. These facilities are operated by massive social welfare agencies and massive non-profits, that is the billion-dollar business, including one that has gotten a lot of attention, something called Southwest Key, which since 2015 has received nearly $1 billion in federal contracts and whose CEO makes nearly $1 million a year in compensation. So once again, my disciplines, urban planning, social welfare, geography, are integral parts of this sprawling non-profit industrial complex, which is now also a prison industrial complex. And so let me conclude this talk by directing your attention to a book that I already mentioned earlier this evening. This magisterial book, Black Reconstruction in America, published in 1935. On the day after Trump's election, I walked into my Histories and Theories of Urban Planning course that I teach at UCLA, a course that all 90 of our first-year graduate students take. And most of us did not know what to say or think. I'd stayed up all night rereading this book, and that is the one book I carried with me. Nothing else made sense. Nothing else provided a path to freedom. Our students immediately organized. They knew what to think and how to respond to the moment. They decided that our curriculum was inadequate to speak to the moment, and they went on to create an entirely new curriculum that they took in addition to their regular classes. They called it abolitionist planning, and they then went on to produce a resource guide for abolitionist planning, which I'm happy to report is making its way around the country. That self-organized curriculum recommitted urban planning to abolition democracy, an idea that is prominent in Black Reconstruction in America, an idea that has a long history. So if racial terror has a long history, so does abolition democracy. If the colonial logic of the border has a long history, so does notions of radical hospitality. So I want to end then by quoting Du Bois, but from another book of his, a beautifully written book called The Souls of Black Folk, published in 1903, because in that book, Du Bois writes in particular about the role of the university. And what he writes about the university was the founding mission statement of the Institute on Inequality and Democracy. But in troubled times of resurgent white nationalism, we find ourselves returning to those words. Du Bois writes in 1903, "The function of the university is not simply to teach breadwinning, or to furnish teachers for the public schools, or to be a center of polite society. It is above all to be the organ of that adjustment between real life and the growing knowledge of life, an adjustment which forms the secret of civilization." For Du Bois, central to that growing knowledge of life was the analysis in the social sciences of what he called the color line. He argued that the color line was the enduring problem of the 20th century. That was his prescient vision of the 20th century. We have started the 21st century and journeyed into it with once again the color line as an enduring problem. For Du Bois, then, the role of knowledge and the role of knowledge for change was to make visible, analyze, and ultimately dismantle the color lines of our times. Thank you.
Right, yeah, thank you very much, Ananya. And Tapio, you have an announcement to make? In the end. Okay, so now the floor is open for, let's start with questions. Comments can come later, after 5 o'clock outside. Who wants to go first? I'll ask, otherwise. Yes. No. You want to go? Do you need this? Should we? Huh?
Oh, thanks. Hello, everyone. You talked about about borders a great deal. Do you advocate for the abolition of borders and of the nation state, or is it a radical reform or something else?
Should we take a couple of questions? All right.
Hello. I have a question regarding your activism at the university, which I find fantastic. I wish we are all, well, I'm trying to follow in that line. But there is always possible complication when you sort of start that line. Mentioned and developed by Wendy Brown very much, between loyalty to your, well, to those in your movement and development of sharp theoretical tools. How do you handle that dilemma?
Thank you. What was your name, sorry? So Susanna asks about activism and scholarship, and what was your name, sorry? Oswald asks about the abolition of state borders, and do you want one more?
They're both huge questions, so why don't I start with these, right?
Yeah, you
the sort of world-changing
yes,
questions.
Let's do that, yeah.
So what I'd like us to think about is, of course, the work that borders do. I mean, we all think about this, and in particular, in the context of sort of an age of renewed policing of borders. The questions I'm asking have to do with who gets to cross borders with ease, right? And for whom is the border then a space of necropolitics, right? And this is so visible in the United States, but also here in Europe as well. So I'm interested in thinking about border-making practices. Of course, we can call for the abolition of borders or the end of the nation state, but you can tell that I'm also rather skeptical of sort of the idea that comes from Derrida that somehow we can imagine a free city that is above nation states, right? That transcends the sovereignty of the nation state, and somehow the sovereignty of the city is a space where there is complete freedom. I think what to me is important then is to think not just about the illegalization of certain bodies, but also then to think about the forms of border crossing, particularly of the wealthy and powerful, right, that are valorized, tolerated, legalized, are never criminalized, right? So who then has the great privilege of an unbounded world, of evading all forms of illegalization and criminalization, and whose spatial practices are constantly illegalized? I think the other thing to think about is that borders are not necessarily about the territory of the nation state, as I briefly noted, and particularly in the work of de Genova and other border studies scholars that I'm drawing on, Juanita Sundberg and others. What matters then is the ways in which the border is remade seemingly everywhere for everyone, but again, not everywhere and not for everyone, right? Again, for targeted communities and for particular sorts of bodies that are constantly subject to border enforcement in spaces that are technically the interior. So the border then becomes a disciplining device. You use the term abolition, and I want to emphasize that term because I started with it. So in fact, abolition democracy calls for an end to this sort of militarization and policing, not just at the borders of national territories, but more broadly in our communities. So it calls for an end to this sort of police logic, not just for the end of the prison industrial complex. And once we think about stolen land, then we realize that the border itself always is a colonial fiction. That Assam border that I'm thinking quite a bit about, right, is a border where India is supposedly protecting itself from Muslim terrorists who are supposedly crossing over from Bangladesh. And that is an act of great post-colonial violence that conjures up certain colonial histories. So our work as scholars, for me, has to do with making evident and making visible these border-making practices and their histories such that we can call attention precisely to that incontrovertible fact of stolen land. The border, the real borders in the United States were drawn between indigenous communities as they were annihilated and what was then established as settler colonial territory. But those borders are not visible to us at all, for example. So the question of the university is very much on my mind, and I'm so glad you raised the work of Wendy Brown. Wendy was my colleague at Berkeley, and we spent quite a bit of time literally at the barricades on strike, mobilizing faculty and students to go to the state capital, to Sacramento, to march. And we quite literally repeatedly shut down the university as the state of California sought to more or less privatize and restructure the public university. So those efforts, in many ways, ended the era of tuition hikes. And in many ways, it was a successful defense of the public university. Here's the thing. In the work that we're doing at the Institute and in the ways in which I'm thinking about the relationship between academic knowledge and social movements, I see social movements in particular, and especially those based in marginalized communities. So in my work, I call these poor people's movements. I see them as producing the most sophisticated theoretical frameworks of our time. Right? We do not necessarily recognize this as theory with a capital T. We might not put that work on the same bookshelf that we put Derrida or Du Bois, and yet I would. So the theoretical foundations of the Institute come from Du Bois, comes from George Lipset's Robin D.G. Kelley, and comes equally from radical social movements in South Central Los Angeles and in Skid Row. One of the reasons why we have an activist in residence program is that I've repeatedly heard from movement leaders and from community-based organizers how, of course, they do not have the luxury of time that we do as academics. Right? Not only do they not have access to the resources we have, right, but they do not often have the luxury of time to write their own histories, to articulate clearly and own their theoretical concepts, to assert their role in the ownership of data. And so again, in building an activist in residence program or in thinking seriously about this, we are not, as a powerful university, providing a gift to those less powerful. We are, in fact, thinking about relationships of accompaniment. We're thinking about solidarity and reciprocity and mutuality. I'll give you one example. A lot of my current empirical research is on what I call racial banishment, the ways in which working class communities of color are being pushed not only to the far peripheries of metropolitan regions in California and around the United States, but the ways in which they are being pushed out through forms of carcerality and criminalization. I started writing about racial banishment, and then in Los Angeles, I found that the leading social movements were already talking about racial banishment. They were already talking about how the standard language, particularly that used by academics, of gentrification and displacement was not sufficient to capture what they were experiencing. So we arrived at a shared concept of racial banishment from different places. And what I'm suggesting is that one place gets valorized and celebrated because we get to publish all of that in peer-reviewed journal articles. And the other place is seen to be the place of folk knowledge. It's seen to be anecdotal. And that is the relationship or the division that we wish to transform through sort of community-based research, but more importantly, through these practices of accompaniment.
Excellent, thank you. Are there other questions? Yes, one. Before I woke up, let me see how many. One, your first, your second, your third. Is that okay? 3 questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
I want to get paid for this, you know. Yeah, please.
Thank you very much for a magnificent talk. I'm just wondering about the concept of stolen land. Can you elaborate on how we can use that in a European context? Because, I mean, normally colonialism is always seen as something external to Europe, not internal to it. So what, I mean, do we need to translate the concept? Can we use it like untranslated, or how to handle that in European context? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yes. I'm interested in what you were saying about activism and the university. And I think there are also those people in between, right, that are not only activists and not only representing an institution. We are, for example, like a couple of urban studies students who are also angry. And I'm just asking myself, what kind of network can be created that is above any kind of institutions, because I don't know, I think that there are many of us who want to tap into a certain discourse and who want to be part of the network, but who maybe will not be able to have a PhD position or something. So I just, I'm interested in that.
Thank you for the questions as well. So I want to return to the 2 maps of LA, and I think that many of us who teach urban planning have been thinking about those things, and you put it very aptly, but broadly speaking, those kinds of things. And you pointed to some kind of emerging conflicts that might, re-articulate planning to something more useful and better. Do you think there are any models that are more fully formed about how this process could take shape from history or, specific places and times?
Models of sort of planning?
Yeah, well, how has planning changed for the better? Because, I mean, it has been worse and it has changed back and forth historically. Are there anything specifically you would want us to look closer at?
All right, 3 wonderful questions again. So the question about how we should think about the concept of stolen land in the European context is intriguing, right? And it's really up to all of you to think about what that translation looks like. A couple of thoughts. One is, in urban studies and more generally in the social sciences, as I'm sure most of you know, the concept of accumulation by dispossession has become greatly influential, and sort of the reinterpretation of that old concept by David Harvey. Partly what scholars who are thinking about stolen land have been working with, and there's a lovely piece by Alyosha Goldstein, who's a professor of American Studies, in in an open access digital volume that you'll find on the website of the Institute, we have an ongoing project called Race and Capitalism, and we did a conference last year, and Professor Goldstein has a short piece on settler colonialism and ideas of property. And what he argues, and this is a common argument in indigenous studies, is that we cannot think about, the starting point cannot be possession. We cannot say that dispossession follows possession. We've got to think about what makes possession possible, right? We've got to think about how dispossession, in fact, is the necessary, I want to say the necessary accompaniment, but also it is sort of the ongoing accompaniment, right, to possession. So calling into question possession is absolutely crucial, and we've got to then think about dispossession as something that renders much of what we occupy as stolen land. Part of this is actual real historical work. So the note that the Chancellor at UCLA sent out yesterday is that he just appointed one of our most important professors of American Indian Studies as special advisor to the Chancellor, right? And her role is going to be to help him navigate how the country's top public university deals with the fact that it's on occupied land. We all acknowledge that at the start of our classes and events. So what? So we're on occupied Tongva land, and how does that change anything, right? And it's also going to be to think about a project that's been going on for a while in LA called Mapping Indigenous LA. So that the places that we take for granted, and we tell histories even of gentrification and displacement, actually have histories that are obscured from sight. So part of this means tracing the genealogy, if you will, right, of theft. And I insist on using the term dispossession rather than displacement, because what is at stake here is not just the ownership of property or land, it is in fact the ownership of self, of personhood. And we can say that that again is unique to American chattel slavery, but not necessarily. In the European context, what is on my mind as an urban planner, and this segues into the two questions on urban planning, is that there is absolutely no way for me to teach modernity and European modernity without thinking about how it was forged in the crucible of colonialism. So when I go back to LA next week, in that Histories and Theories of Urban Planning class, which is as grim as my talk and Mustafa's introduction, the students have an existential crisis in that class, right? It's their first quarter as budding urban planners. And they're like, this is our discipline and profession. So, you know, the standard histories of European modernity in urban planning are a celebration of architects such as Corbusier. It is a location of questions of liberty and freedom in the 1871 Commune of Paris, right? The barricades of 1848, and I try to teach a very different history, which is that many of the technologies of modern urban planning were forged in the context of French colonialism in North Africa, in Algeria and Morocco, right? We can talk about 1871 as a brilliant and important insurrection that gives us some sort of blueprint for liberty, but not really, because in fact what had already happened in Algeria, specifically in Kabyle, were incredible insurrections, and the same generals that smashed those insurrections in Algeria smashed the commune in Paris. And as historians have written, the communards of Paris were unaware of the colonial context, and it is only when they were all on the same ships being sent to the labor colonies of New Caledonia that they were ashamed, right, of their bourgeois, what they then came to see as quite bourgeois understandings of liberty, and their absolute ignorance of a colonial context. So I think that there are many ways in which we can think about Europe relationally, and there's a glimpse of that in Derrida's struggles with Algeria that I find to be interesting. But I think the concept of stolen land, therefore, can be understood both as something within Europe and also the elsewheres of Europe that have made possible the wealth. So in urban planning, as we think, and as we think more broadly about activism in the university, I think part of this is then thinking about planning, but almost all of our disciplines in a sort of dynamic way. So the debates in the United States have been about whether or not there's a role for academics and professionals to play in the great struggles of our time. So I mentioned that UCLA students did this wonderful work on abolitionist planning. Well, other graduate students have recently written pieces saying there's no role for planners in abolition. There's no role for planners, with a capital P, in freedom struggles. Why? Because planning has, throughout its history, modern urban planning, has been a conduit for the very forms of racialized violence that abolition seeks to end. The hope is often placed in what are called insurgent planners, planners in solidarity with movements. I'm not fond of some of these distinctions, partly because I think the task of decolonizing the university is to recognize that none of us occupy a place of innocence, that we are all part of the system of racial capitalism, whether as young professionals or as established academics. And if we start from that place of complicity, of embeddedness in racial capitalism, what then are the forms of change we hope to make? And for me, that has to do with thinking about how, whether or not you have a PhD, whether or not you have the capacity to launch that network, you can, in fact, utilize the resources of your discipline as well as of the university to make change. We need to do a better job, I think, in telling stories of those forms of change-making and thinking about when that point of change happens. It's happened in urban planning a few times. It happened in the 1960s in the US, primarily because urban planning came to be embedded in Black liberation movements. It's happening now as urban planning students realize that there is no way to think about the practice of planning without thinking about police violence, Black death, racialized dispossession. Right? So that embeddedness for me is key, but it's also incumbent then upon those of us who are inside the university to think about what those formats of change might be. And that part of that is simply the syllabus that we teach. But the other piece of this is to recognize that universities are incredibly well-resourced institutions that have the capacity to create and convene those networks. So repeatedly what I hear from my colleagues in social movement or young professionals is that established academics, institutes, universities have the power to convene. We have the power to represent, we have the power to curate. What we do with that power matters greatly. And how we build an infrastructure of change is crucial. One of the biggest issues in the United States today is that right-wing nationalism has built a really powerful and successful infrastructure made up of think tanks, media organizations such as Bannon's Breitbart News, but also Fox News. I mean, the word news has to be used lightly here, right? But also loud public intellectuals, right? This didn't just happen overnight. As social scientists have shown, this was built up over decades with big money, with the ways in which big money has been able to enter politics, but there's an infrastructure. There is no such infrastructure on the left. How do we build that infrastructure? And this is not about partisan politics. This is about that infrastructure. So one of the things that has happened in the United States, two networks that are slowly emerging that might be of interest here. One is that university professors, particularly those without tenure, particularly those not in tenure-track positions, are very vulnerable when they speak out against Trumpism. Right? That vulnerability is real. The consequences are often immediate, as in firing. And we've seen several of these cases. Aside from the right-wing hate attacks, right? So I love that often my Twitter feed is filled with accusations that I'm some sort of ISIS terrorist, because that is supposedly the worst thing one can say. Universities have done a shoddy job of protecting academic freedom. Academic freedom as an ideal has been co-opted by the right. The network that existed and that has been deployed, I think quite successfully, is something called the American Association of University Professors, which has insisted on upholding academic freedom and holding universities accountable and reversing the firings of those who've spoken out against the Trump administration. They also did something really important early on during the Trump regime. So the right-wing infrastructures include something called campus reform, which is a scrutiny of what we all teach in our classrooms and what we publish, with campus reporters who sneak into classrooms and then write reports on what professors are teaching, and then identify un-American professors. So the AAUP early on simply asked all of us to register ourselves as un-American without waiting for us to be reported as un-American, right? So there have been all of these strategies, if you will, of networking around a really important idea, which is academic freedom, which I believe in strongly and needs to be taken back. The second example of networks has to do with teaching. So one experiment that we are undertaking at the Institute next quarter in January is something called Activist Graduate School. There's a lot of interest in building up an infrastructure of progressive ideas and practices. Foundations are putting money behind this. This particular idea is the work of someone called Micah White, who was one of the main organizers of Occupy Wall Street. And Micah White now has this project called Activist Graduate School, which is a course taught at a university, taken by graduate students. The whole thing is filmed and then turned into online modules for young professionals and activists, whether they're full-time activists or not, who are interested in doing this work. So he's doing the first course at Bard College this fall on a very important theme, why do social movements fail? Part 2 will be at UCLA in January and February, and we're going to do it on housing justice activism, past and present. So these are tiny efforts to build up that infrastructure, but I think it's absolutely necessary for us to even do those tiny pieces using the resources of the university. I'm going to recommend one book that perhaps is not read widely in Europe, but that for me was life-changing in thinking about my role in the university. And that is a book called The Undercommons by Stefan O'Harney and Fred Moten. Our graduate students at UCLA have used the idea of undercommons to decolonize the university. And they talk about the fact that as subversive public intellectuals, not just as critical thinkers, they're like, yeah, everyone does critical thinking, but to be subversive public intellectuals and subversive scholars who really want to make change, those who want to fight for social justice. You've got to, they argue, be in a criminal relationship with the university, okay? You've got to think about how you use the resources of the university precisely to counter racialized dispossession. And that notion of taking criminality and turning it on its head, of taking theft and turning it on its head, and that if we are, in fact, part of institutions that are built anyway on racial capitalism, how then do we forge that criminal relationship with the university? I will say that I'm very fortunate to be at a public university where I, as director of one of the main research institutes, can say, the methodology of the institute is that we have a criminal relationship with the university, right? So I acknowledge that that is not always possible. But the Undercommons, as building a space of commons at the university, one that insists on pedagogies of presence, one that is attentive to the resources we have, for me has been really important.
Right, now almost 5 o'clock, tea time. Are there any questions that you feel I really have to ask this because I can't sleep tonight otherwise? Are you sure? I'll bring it to you, but first maybe Tapio should make the announcement, or yeah, then you should all wait until after.
It's being filmed, and therefore...
Yeah, you need it for the film.
I don't know, maybe it's a banal question, but why now? Why at this moment? You said that this is a specific time, Trump is something new. So is there something specific in the racial capitalism at this time that's open up? So that's the question.
No,
why
it's not a bad question at all. It goes to the heart of the talk. So on the one hand, I'm arguing that we're looking at continuities in what, following Gilroy, I'm calling racial terror, right? That these are colonial logics. But I'm also very interested at the specific historical conjunctures at which these colonial logics are reactivated and repurposed, right? And I'm using this idea of conjuncture in a Gramscian way, so we can think about Stuart Hall's work as he examines Thatcherism as a very particular moment in Great Britain and why he spent so much time thinking about that. But as Gramsci notes in his work on conjuncture, which is for him very much a question of crisis, but related to crisis for Gramsci is a notion of change. Right? Not always change that is progressive, but change. For me, Trumpism, on the one hand, is resurgent white nationalism, but I'm also arguing, and I've argued, and often argued in disagreement with many of my colleagues in the UC system, that this is a rupture. So, for example, some of the leading leftist public intellectuals in the US have said, there is no difference between the Obama administration and the Trump administration. None. Obama was deporter-in-chief. There were more deportations under Obama than any other US president. Obama perfected drone killings, right? And they're like, well, what is different about Trump? Or many, leading up to the election, said, well, there isn't going to be a huge difference whether we have Hillary Clinton, right, who would be a warmongering president, and Donald Trump. It's all the same. It's one big old system that never changes. So on the one hand, I'm arguing for continuity, but on the other hand, I'm arguing that no, there is a rupture. And as I noted early on in the talk, for me, that rupture is the institutionalization of white nationalism in statecraft and state power. It is not that the US has never had a travel ban before, but not in recent times with this targeting of religious identity and religious difference upheld by the Supreme Court. It is not that in the United States women always have had control over their bodies. But it's going to be quite something to see in 2019, most likely, the loss of reproductive rights for women under the banner of Christian evangelism. So in fact, that rupture is one that can be seen as an amplification, but I think most importantly, it is an institutionalization of what Gilroy would call raciology. Gilroy's argument is about fascism, so we can use that term too. And there are so many comparisons that are drawn between this moment in the United States and the rise of Nazi Germany. Whether we think about fascism as particularly wedded to that moment and that regime, or we think about it more broadly, then once again one can think about that rupture. As someone who grew up in India and who does a lot of research in India, I can tell you that the Modi government in India is a rupture. Right? It is not that India has not had Islamophobia before. We are at our very core as a country deeply Islamophobic. And yet, these technologies of exclusion and illegalization and of lynching that we now see in India are not just being tolerated by the state, they are being practiced by the very agencies of government. Right? It is the use of the law itself to enact death that I'm particularly interested in. And that, for me, is a rupture, though of course there are historical precedents on which this builds and which will make this seem familiar rather than wholly new.
Okay, before closing, I want to make an announcement for the next seminar on knowledge for change. It's the 21st of November. Rainer Bauböck from European University Institute in Florence, Italy, will come and hold a speech with the title Migration and Mobility, European Dilemmas. So you're all warmly welcome the 21st of November. But of course, you would share with me warm thanks to Mustafa, to holding this seminar, but of course, Ananya. This is just some small token. Come on. I think you really, this is a series of knowledge for change, and you're really, in your very direct and mind-provocative way, being scrutinizing it. So we are very grateful for your contribution. So thank you, and join me in a warm applause to Ananya.